Erin Patterson was the last person anyone in Leongatha expected to see in handcuffs. Yet within months, the quiet home cook would be accused of serving a family lunch laced with one of the deadliest substances on earth, turning a warm Sunday gathering into a headline-grabbing tragedy. Leongatha was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where the bakery knew your coffee order before you even asked, and where the loudest sound on a Sunday afternoon was the church bell. It was a small, self-contained town on the outskirts of Melbourne, surrounded by rolling green hills and quiet country roads. People moved there for peace, for space, and for the comforting certainty that nothing bad ever really happened. But in the winter of that year, the kind of peace Leongatha had always known was shattered forever. The story began without any drama, no police sirens, no late-night chases, no dark alleys. It started in a weatherboard house with a well-kept garden, where a woman named Erin Patterson was preparing for what should have been an ordinary family lunch. She was a familiar face in the neighborhood, often spotted carrying bags of groceries from the local market or tending to her roses on mild afternoons. Those who knew her described her as polite, reserved, and in some ways a little hard to read. She wasn't the kind of person to make headlines, and perhaps that was why it came as such a shock when she did. On that particular morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, and a cold wind blew in from the south. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional car heading towards the shops. Inside Erin's kitchen, the smell of cooking filled the air. She had been preparing her days, collecting ingredients, cleaning the house, and ensuring everything was just right. To anyone passing by, it was the picture of hospitality, a woman bringing her family together over a warm meal. The guests she expected that day were not strangers. They were relatives, people she had known for years, people she had shared holidays and family stories with. A lunch like this should have been a time for catching up, laughing about the past, and enjoying good food. But what no one knew was that this meal would never be forgotten, not because of the conversation, not because of the recipe, but because of what would happen just hours later. There was nothing unusual in the way the day unfolded at first. The guests arrived, the food was served, and the conversation began. Outside, the town went on as it always did. Children playing in yards, shopkeepers chatting with customers, dogs barking behind fences. Yet inside that house, something far more sinister was quietly taking shape. None of the people around that table could have guessed that this would be their last shared meal, or that the events of the afternoon would echo through the community for years to come. In small towns like Leongatha, news travels fast, but tragedy travels faster. By the end of the day, whispers had already started. Ambulances seen outside Erin's home, a family lunch gone wrong, hospital admissions in critical condition. At first, no one knew the cause. Was it an allergic reaction, a sudden illness, or something much darker? The answers would come soon enough, and when they did, they would shake the image of Leongatha as a safe and simple place. The idea that danger could be hiding in something as ordinary as a home-cooked meal was unthinkable, yet it had happened. And for Erin Patterson, the woman at the center of it all, life in her quiet suburban street would never be the same again. The table had been set with care, each place neatly arranged with polished cutlery and folded napkins. The air in the dining room was warm from the oven, carrying the rich aroma of roasted beef and buttered pastry. On the counter in the kitchen sat the centerpiece of the meal, a golden beef Wellington, its pastry crust gleaming in the light. Erin had made it many times before, a recipe she seemed to know by heart. The layers of mushroom duxelles, tender beef and flaky pastry looked like something from a cooking magazine. It was the kind of dish that spoke of effort, skill, and the intention to impress. The guests gathered, chatting casually as they found their seats. Plates were filled, glasses poured, and the meal began in the way all good lunches do, without hurry. Conversation rose and fell, the clink of cutlery punctuating each pause. No one questioned the food in front of them. It was familiar, home-cooked, the kind of meal that carried a certain trust. The mushroom filling blended seamlessly into the dish, its earthy flavor adding depth. It seemed in that moment like nothing more than a warm, comforting family tradition. But as the afternoon passed, subtle changes began to appear. A sense of unease crept into the room. At first it was only a quiet mention of feeling lightheaded, brushed off with a laugh. Then came a complaint of nausea, followed by an alarming paleness in the faces around the table. One by one, the guests began to feel the same: stomach cramps, dizziness, waves of sickness that grew more severe with each passing minute. What had been a relaxed gathering was rapidly turning into something far more alarming. Phones were pulled out, calls made, voices rising in panic. Within the hour, ambulances arrived, the sound of their sirens breaking the quiet of the street. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as paramedics moved quickly, their urgency unmistakable. Guests were stretchered out, oxygen masks pressed to their faces, monitors beeping steadily as they were loaded into waiting vehicles. The golden beef Wellington sat untouched on the table, the remaining slices now an object of suspicion rather than appetite. At the hospital, doctors began a series of tests, trying to piece together what could have caused such a sudden and violent illness. At first, the assumption was food poisoning, something common, unpleasant, but rarely deadly. Yet the symptoms were unusually severe. Blood work came back with disturbing results, pointing toward a toxin far more dangerous than anything found in spoiled meat or undercooked food. The culprit was soon identified: amatoxins, the lethal compounds found in death cap mushrooms. It was a shocking revelation. Death caps were not only rare but almost always fatal if ingested. They attacked the liver and kidneys relentlessly, with no guaranteed cure. The only hope was early detection and intensive treatment, but for some, even that was not enough. In that cold, clinical hospital setting, the reality set in. This had not been an accident of spoiled ingredients or careless cooking. The lunch had contained one of the deadliest substances known to nature. And from that moment forward, every question turned toward Erin Patterson and the meal she had so carefully prepared. In the days after the hospital admissions, the shock that swept through the community was matched only by the curiosity of investigators. At first, there had been a possibility that the poisoning was a tragic accident, the result of a simple mistake in the kitchen. But as police began piecing together the details, the picture became more complicated. Detectives spoke to doctors, who confirmed that the level of toxins found in the victims was so high that the mushrooms must have been consumed in a concentrated form. That detail alone raised questions. How had such a dangerous ingredient ended up in a meal prepared by someone who claimed to be an experienced home cook? While the victims fought for their lives, officers visited Erin Patterson's home. The kitchen was clean, almost too clean, with few signs of the meal that had been served. Investigators collected scraps from the compost bin, along with utensils, cutting boards, and containers. They wanted to understand exactly how the mushrooms had been prepared and where they had come from. Erin explained that she had bought some ingredients from a local supermarket and others from an Asian grocery, insisting she had no idea the mushrooms could be dangerous. But to the police, her story left gaps they were determined to close. It was during these early interviews that other troubling information began to surface. Months earlier, Erin's former husband had reportedly fallen violently ill after a meal she had cooked for him. He had survived, and at the time, no one had linked the illness to poisoning. But the similarity in circumstances was impossible to ignore. Detectives also learned of other minor incidents. Friends or acquaintances who had suffered unexplained stomach problems after visiting her home, cases that had gone unreported because the symptoms were temporary. While none of these were fatal, they began to form a troubling pattern. The local media caught wind of the investigation, and within days, Erin's name was known far beyond Lungonga. Headlines labeled her the Mushroom Murderer and the Lunch Hostess of Death. Television crews arrived, filling the quiet street with camera tripods and flashing lights. The more the story spread, the more tips poured into the police hotline. Some callers claimed to have known Erin for years. Others spoke of her as if they had suspected something unusual about her all along. For investigators, it was both a blessing and a challenge. Sorting useful information from speculation was a painstaking process. The hospital updates were grim. 3 of the guests were not responding to treatment, their organs failing despite doctors' best efforts. Only 1 appeared to have a chance of recovery. Each update brought a heavier weight to the investigation, shifting the focus from food safety to suspected homicide. The idea that the poisoning might have been intentional became impossible to dismiss. By the end of the week, detectives had a new priority: retracing Erin's movements before the lunch. Every purchase, every conversation, every visit to a shop or market was logged and analyzed. It was no longer just about finding out what had happened. It was about proving whether someone had meant for it to happen. And in that small country town, where people had once felt certain they knew their neighbors, suspicion had begun to take root in every whispered conversation. The investigation soon moved beyond Erin Patterson's home and into the surrounding countryside. Detectives knew that to understand how the deadly mushrooms had ended up in the meal, they had to trace their source. Death-cap mushrooms were not common in Victoria, but experts from the state's mycology unit explained that they could occasionally be found in certain moist, shaded environments, especially near non-native trees like oaks. These specialists joined the police as they combed through nearby state forests and public parks, searching for anything that might match the lethal fungi found in the victims' systems. The search was methodical. Teams in gloves and protective gear worked in tight grids, moving slowly so that no small patch of ground was overlooked. They inspected fallen logs, piles of wet leaves, and moss-covered roots, their eyes scanning for the telltale pale caps and smooth white stems that marked the mushroom as deadly. When a potential specimen was found, it was carefully bagged and labeled, its location marked on a map. It was painstaking work, but any lead could prove critical. Meanwhile, forensic scientists were busy in the lab, analyzing the contents of Erin's compost bin. There, among ordinary scraps of food, they discovered fragments of mushrooms that matched the shape and texture of death caps. The microscopic analysis confirmed the presence of amatoxins, identical to those detected in the victim's blood. The compost bin evidence was damning. It meant the mushrooms had been handled, chopped, and discarded in Erin's own kitchen. This was no case of an accidental mushroom falling into the pot from an outside source. Investigators also checked local shops and markets, questioning store owners about recent sales of fresh mushrooms. While most retailers sold only commercially farmed varieties, there was always the possibility that someone had foraged wild mushrooms and sold them informally. No clear record emerged, leaving the forest search as the most promising lead. One particularly damp morning, a team in the forest made a discovery that sent ripples through the investigative unit. Beneath a cluster of oak trees, they found several fully grown death caps, their caps slick from recent rain. While finding them in nature wasn't unusual in itself, the proximity to Erin's regular walking route was significant. Locals recalled seeing her pass through that area with shopping bags and a basket on more than one occasion. This information was quietly added to the growing timeline of her movements. The evidence was stacking up, but the real challenge lay in proving intent. Picking a death cap could be explained as a mistake by someone inexperienced in foraging, but combined with the compost bin findings, the rare location of the mushrooms, and her knowledge of cooking, investigators were beginning to believe there was nothing accidental about the lunch she had served. Back in Longatha, the community was watching every development with morbid fascination. The image of police in bright vests and gloves, combing through the damp forest, carefully lifting poisonous fungi into evidence bags, only fueled the rumors. Each new detail in the case seemed to blur the line between accident and murder, and the question on everyone's lips was no longer what had happened. It was why. As the weeks passed, the focus of the investigation shifted from gathering physical evidence to uncovering the possible reasons behind the tragedy. Detectives began to examine Erin Patterson's life in detail, moving beyond the kitchen and the forest to the more private corners of her personal affairs. On the surface, she appeared to live a modest, unremarkable life, a neat home, quiet routines and the occasional social gathering. But beneath that calm exterior, investigators discovered a web of financial pressures and complicated family relationships that painted a very different picture. Bank records revealed that Erin had been struggling with mounting debts. Credit cards carried high balances and repayments were often late. There were also unexpected withdrawals and transfers that raised eyebrows. Investigators dug deeper and found documents relating to life insurance policies. Several had been taken out in recent years, some naming her as the sole beneficiary. While taking out insurance on loved ones was not a crime in itself, the timing and coverage amounts stood out, especially when matched with the people who had been at the fatal lunch. The strained history between Erin and certain family members also became clear. Disagreements over property, inheritance disputes, and long-standing grudges had created fractures in relationships that were once close. Witnesses described gatherings where tension simmered beneath polite conversation, a sharp contrast to the public image of a close-knit family. These tensions, combined with financial motives, gave investigators a potential explanation for why such a dangerous act might have been carried out. Police also reviewed her internet activity and past purchases. Among ordinary online orders, they found searches related to identifying wild mushrooms, their culinary uses, and their toxic effects. There were also queries about how certain poisons worked and whether they could be detected after cooking. Though none of these searches proved intent beyond doubt, they added to a growing body of circumstantial evidence. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed, and the accounts varied. Some defended her character, insisting she was incapable of harming anyone. Others recalled moments that seemed strange in hindsight, meals where certain dishes were served only to specific people, or where she insisted on controlling all aspects of the cooking. One neighbor mentioned seeing her wearing gloves while preparing food, something they found unusual but had not questioned at the time. As this information came together, detectives began to form a theory: the poisoning was not the result of ignorance or bad luck, but a deliberate act disguised as an accident. The combination of money troubles, family disputes, and a carefully prepared meal pointed to a calculated plan. By now, the public's perception of Erin had shifted dramatically. She was no longer seen simply as an unlucky hostess caught in a tragedy, but as someone who might have had everything to gain from the loss of those who sat at her table. The polite smiles and warm hospitality that once defined her were replaced in the public imagination by a far colder image, that of a woman who could turn something as ordinary as a family lunch into a deadly trap. And though she continued to deny any wrongdoing, the circle of suspicion was closing tightly around her. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that certain pieces of the puzzle were missing. Literally, one of the first discoveries was that Erin Patterson's home security system, which normally recorded both the inside and outside of the property, had been switched off on the day of the fatal lunch. Detectives confirmed that the cameras were usually kept running, providing a constant stream of footage. Erin explained that she had turned them off because she didn't want to make guests uncomfortable, but the timing raised immediate suspicion. Without those recordings, there was no visual record of who entered the kitchen, what ingredients were used, or how the meal was prepared. The absence of surveillance was not the only gap. Erin had kept a handwritten recipe book for years, filled with family dishes, notes on ingredients, and small personal adjustments to cooking methods. Friends recalled seeing her use it often, especially for elaborate meals. But when police searched the house after the incident, the book was nowhere to be found. Erin claimed she had misplaced it, yet thorough searches of the property, including drawers, cupboards, and even the garage, turned up nothing. Investigators suspected it had been deliberately removed, possibly because it contained a record of the mushroom dish and its preparation. There were other signs of selective cleaning in the kitchen. Forensic teams found that several surfaces had been wiped down with bleach, an unusual step for someone who had just hosted a lunch. Traces of latex gloves were found in the rubbish, the fingertips smudged with what later tested as mushroom residue. While gloves might be used for hygiene, the forensic timeline suggested they had been worn during food preparation and discarded before the guests arrived. This added another layer of intrigue. If the meal was meant to be safe, why the need for such precautions? Detectives also uncovered inconsistencies in Erin's account of her shopping trip before the lunch. Receipts showed purchases from a local supermarket, but CCTV from another store suggested she had visited an area where foraged goods were sometimes sold privately. The identity of the person she met there remained unclear, as the footage was too distant to make out faces. The missing security footage, the vanished recipe book, and the unusual cleaning all pointed towards an intentional removal of evidence. Each absence spoke as loudly as the physical clues that had been collected. To the police, it looked like an effort to erase the trail between the mushrooms in the forest and the lunch on the table. In the court of public opinion, these revelations only hardened the image of Erin as someone hiding the truth. The story was no longer about a single tragic meal. It had become a complex case involving calculated actions before and after the event. The narrative of a grieving hostess was replaced by that of a meticulous planner, someone who understood how to remove traces and create gaps in the timeline. And with each missing piece, the suspicion against her grew heavier, turning what had begun as a food safety investigation into the makings of a criminal case built on secrecy, silence, and shadows. The arrest came on a crisp morning, months after the fatal lunch, when the investigation had finally reached a tipping point. For weeks, detectives had worked quietly in the background, cross-checking toxicology reports, financial documents, and witness statements. Every lead had been pursued, every inconsistency scrutinized, until there was enough evidence to convince prosecutors they could take the case to court. When the decision was made, the operation to bring Erin Patterson into custody was swift and deliberate. Police cars arrived just after sunrise, their tires crunching over the gravel driveway. Officers stepped out, some in plain clothes, others in uniform, moving with the calm precision of people who had rehearsed this moment. Erin was inside the house, reportedly making breakfast. She was told she was under arrest on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Neighbors who witnessed the scene later described it as quiet but tense. Erin did not resist, but her face, pale and unreadable, gave away nothing about what she might have been feeling. Word of the arrest spread through Leongatha before the police cars had even left her street. In a town where gossip could travel faster than the wind, the news was unstoppable. Within an hour, media vans were parked outside the police station, camera crews ready to capture any glimpse of the accused. National networks interrupted regular programming to report the story, while online headlines flashed across screens: Mushroom Murderer charge, fatal lunch hostess in custody. The public reaction was divided. Some saw the arrest as inevitable, a natural conclusion after months of suspicion and damning evidence. Others clung to the belief that Erin was innocent, the victim of a chain of coincidences and relentless media pressure. Social media became a battleground of theories, accusations, and amateur investigations. Hashtags trended, and opinion pieces flooded newspapers, each framing the case through a different lens: domestic tragedy, calculated murder, or a miscarriage of justice in the making. Inside the station, Erin was processed and questioned again, this time with the weight of formal charges against her. Prosecutors outlined their case, built on forensic analysis of mushroom fragments, the compost bin findings, financial motives, missing evidence, and the suspicious gaps in her story. Every detail was now part of a narrative designed to persuade a jury that what had happened was no accident. Outside, the atmosphere grew more frenzied. Reporters chased anyone connected to Erin, friends, neighbors, shopkeepers, seeking soundbites and headlines. The quiet street where she once lived became a stage for photographers, each hoping for a defining image that would capture the essence of the case. As Erin was led from the station to a waiting vehicle, the cameras flashed in rapid bursts. She kept her eyes forward, her expression fixed, saying nothing to the reporters who called her name. For the first time, the story that had been built from fragments, rumors, and partial truths now had a concrete turning point. She would face trial, and in the eyes of the public, that meant the next chapter would decide whether she was a victim of circumstance or one of the most calculated killers the country had ever seen. The trial became one of the most closely watched court cases in the country, drawing journalists from across Australia and even from overseas. For weeks, the courthouse steps were lined with camera crews, reporters and curious onlookers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had been at the center of so much speculation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with the anticipation of a verdict that would either condemn or clear Erin Patterson. Prosecutors presented their case with meticulous detail, building a timeline that began long before the fatal lunch. They laid out the financial struggles, the strained family relationships, and the series of suspicious incidents involving meals Erin had prepared in the past. Photographs of the mushroom fragments from the compost bin were displayed to the jury, alongside expert testimony explaining how death caps could be mistaken for edible varieties by the untrained eye, yet were instantly recognizable to anyone who had studied them. Toxicologists described how ammonia toxins worked, explaining the irreversible damage they caused to the liver and kidneys, often leading to death within days. They showed lab reports proving that the exact same toxins found in the mushrooms from Erin's home matched those in the victim's blood. Forensic evidence about the latex gloves, the missing recipe book, and the wiped-down kitchen surfaces added weight to the theory that the poisoning had been deliberate. The defense painted a different picture, portraying Erin as an unlucky home cook caught in a tragic accident. They argued that she had no reason to harm her family and that any suspicious behavior after the lunch was the result of panic, not guilt. They highlighted the absence of a direct witness to her intentionally using death caps, suggesting that the case was built on assumptions and circumstantial links, rather than concrete proof. The jury listened as weeks of evidence unfolded, each day revealing new angles and unanswered questions. Witnesses described Erin's calm demeanor after the lunch, which some saw as composure and others as chilling detachment. Others recalled her showing genuine distress when she learned of the victim's deteriorating conditions. When both sides had finished their arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. The wait was long, stretching into several days, with the courthouse surrounded by a constant buzz of media updates and public speculation. Finally, the call came that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled quickly, every seat taken. Erin sat at the defense table, her face as unreadable as it had been on the day of her arrest. The jury foreperson stood, delivering the verdict, guilty on all counts. A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's order. Erin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not speak, did not show visible emotion, and did not offer an explanation. In the months that followed, the case became part of Australia's true crime history, its details retold in documentaries, books, and late-night conversations. The idea that something as ordinary as a family lunch could be turned into a deadly weapon left a lasting scar on the national imagination, and Erin Patterson, whether seen as a calculating killer or a victim of fate, would remain a name forever linked to one of the most unsettling crimes Melbourne had ever seen.